I just realized that it's so weird to stand in front of people and talk and have mics, not one but two. So thank you, Pier Paolo, for this invitation. I didn't really, first thank you because I never ever thought I will be invited to think with a book that is 300 years old, but it has been incredible thinking, like it has been something that pushed me really to rethink certain things I've been doing. And thank you, Martin, for breaking this in-person ice. I will be using certain points from Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach's book, mostly also through the reading by Pier Paolo Tamburelli, not because I think one needs to use the lens of the conference convener, but because some of the observations in his text in San Rocco that he was generous enough to share with me were, well, really exciting for me, and were coming very close to how I was looking at this book. Before I start, I kind of want to thank again Pier Paolo for this invitation. I would like to thank Ernst for kind of accommodating all my questions and needs, considering that I have had to flew in this morning on 6 a.m. flight from London, so I'm really, really sleep deprived. So I hope there will be some coherence in what I will be reading. As this talk discusses the question of situatedness, or how one situates oneself within the practice in relation to what one sees in architecture, and the trouble of situating oneself both contemporary and historically, I will briefly situate the position from which I'm looking at Entwurf, but also from which I have been looking at the episodes in which I try to think this book with. I teach and live in London since September 2020, but I was born in what used to be Yugoslavia and is now Serbia, where I studied architecture. So therefore, one can say that I'm looking at this material and the history of capital A architecture from the Balkans, from Southeast Europe, from all this and also as a partly former colonial subject of Habsburg Empire, because some of my family was from Slovenia, other parts were from the south, so there is also this Ottoman relation there. So, and I understand situatedness as a not necessarily super faithful reader, but definitely as a reader and influenced by Donna Haraway. Why is this important? This is important because it matters from which position we ask the question and we seek knowledge. And it matters how we understand this position, and it matters how we want, who we want to be in conversation with, but also how we understand this relation that is established when we are having a conversation with a certain material, especially with material that seems so far away, far out from what we usually think about. So this is something that is also, I think, important with Fischer and Entwurff as well, especially as it, for me, seems that one of the questions that he has been asking, indeed, are also the questions of how does he situate himself in relation to the world and in relation not only to the architectural profession, but I think more than that, in relation to built environment and where life happens. And these questions are, of course, as many questions that we as an architect ask, elusive and slippery, and they change in relation to what do we want materials we worked with to do. And I think this is the quality of these books, which I think makes us sit and spend a day thinking about it. It's really difficult to pin down, and it really changes when you flip from page to page. I think it's also useful to remind, therefore, that the territory, if I'm allowed to use the term territory for the world in 1721, I'm from, was still, so the Balkan Peninsula was at that moment still divided between Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that in the moment when Entwurff was conceived, because its origin is a little bit before it was published, that territory was in a state of turmoil. In 1977, Austrian troops led by Prince Eugen of Savoy captured Belgrade and kept the control from the Ottoman Empire and kept the control of the territory until 1739 Treaty of Belgrade, after which Ottoman Empire again regained the control of northern Bosnia, Habsburg Serbia, and southern parts of Banat of Temeswar. I think this is important in order to because this is the world to which this book is responding. I think it's also important to remember that the Great Expectations, another reference, the Great Exhibition is still 130 years away from its conceptualization. So is Semper's Die Stil, and that even Linnaeus' Systema Natura is 14 years away. In that context, it is possible to see this book as a prompt to think across the difference and not to universalize this difference into this hierarchical genealogical system. It is pre-modern, but maybe it is another lineage suppressed to what has been around, as always overrepresented from the West. And as Pier Paolo states in his text, Entwurff is a list. It is resolutely not a Bannister-Fletcher's tree, but also it is a job portfolio in which architects tries to situate his practice in space and time. My talk will be a quick run through 2 episodes. Originally there were supposed to be 3, and I will just mention what I wanted to be the 3rd episode. And I will look at these 2 episodes from a different length as they build from different aspects. One builds on my research that I have been doing, and another one was more from my interest and what I generally know about one specific book that I think is important to bring in this context. But what connects all of these episodes is that they discuss the problem architects have of situating themselves in the context in which is always larger than they are, either politically or economically, and often there is no difference between the two. Part of it is also how one situates in relation to capital A architecture at large. All episodes are related to the context from which I speak, and the one from which I look at this book, the context of Yugoslavia, and the time-wise, they span between 1957 to late 1980s, so a really different time frame. While this temporality seems at odds with the book published 200 or something years before the episodes I'm looking at, what connects is that this was the period in which these episodes occur, were the period where that part of the world was trying to situate itself in relation to the kind of the world. So Yugoslavia was trying to situate itself in relation to the world for the first time, maybe on its own terms and not on the terms of outside view. And that architectural practice and architects across time, space and time had to think this through as well. And they had to think this in relation, but also not in subjugation to the modernist language. So, okay, let's start. So the first episode takes us to 1957 and to the publication of the book Arhitektura Bosne I put u savremeno by architects Juraj Neidhardt and Dušan Grabrijan. The title is translated into English as Architecture of Bosnia and the Way Modernity. This troubling translation, especially of the subclass, goes beyond questionable English, because savremeno is not necessarily modernity, and it's and there is no kind of one-on-one translation. So the more correct translation would be Architecture of Bosnia and the Way or Road into the contemporaneity, into the present, or maybe into modern. But I think this tension is really important to capture. While the architectural language, while for the architects who made this book, the architectural language that would get this territory into this contemporary moment was modern language of modern architecture. They also use this language as the way to see and form differently and expand understanding of what modern language of architecture can be. And I insist on this because the present and the future was different than the entry of the capital M for them, than the entry into capital M modernity as we know it today. This was not about necessarily universalizing, it was not necessarily about trying to write this into the canon of Western architecture. So the table with the title or the translation is something that also connects this book to the Fischer's book. And this is something that Pier Paolo already mentioned in his introduction today. And the fact, and I think that here it's really important to kind of keep in mind this, this view that Entwurf was not an intention to make a universal history of architecture, and it was not an intention to make a hierarchical genealogical claim. Can we situately actually read the works from the moments when they were made? And yes and no, because we have to become first aware what are the eyes with which we look at this material. So, for example, in number of there's not a lot of text about Entwurf, but there is always the problem of trying to look at the reception of these books, such as Fischer's books, through the eyes of Bannister Fletcher's theory of architecture, even though that we are trying to unlearn this idea that every look into the history is somehow trying to find the logical, genealogical coming to now, and not maybe to understand, to look into the context without making a claim of hierarchy. And I think this is something that is important to think with, or at least for me it's really important to think with. So what I'm interested here is this tension within the profession to confirm to specific canonical understandings of specific modernist understanding of architecture, which is fortunately starting to crumble, and how to actually stay with the complexity and not to reduce the complexity. So it's not about monumental synthesis, and it's not even about monumental, though monumental is what at the first time kind of bursts out of Entwurf, but I think that what is really great, and I think, Martin, I really appreciate that you brought this up, the column is not isolated. It is actually situated within the life. And geeky me really loved the end of San Rocco article with all the kind of numbers of people and stuff. And it was really this, like, I think that it's really important that when we look at Entwurf, that we look at this as well. It is an attempt to situate this built in unbuilt, which creates life, and that there is no cutting off this into the elements. So, but of course, this book is monumental because it is also about the power, and it is also about history of writing the power into the history of art by looking into the architectural element. Oh, sorry, I just got confused. Let's just simplify. It is a book about power, but let's not take that against it. So, and it was a job portfolio, which also connects it to the Arhitektura Bosne i put u savremeno, because that was also job portfolios there. And Juraj Neidhardt, the architect, one of the architects who did this book after passing of Dušan Grabrian, before the publication of the book, have decided to include in the final version of the book a big chunk of, to grow the book to one-third of add material which enlarged the book to like 30%, most of which were his project. So one can also see this Arhitektura Bosne i put u savremeno as a way in which architect situates his architecture within the larger context, also in order to establish himself as an architect, in a moment of crisis, 15-year-old crisis in the personal or in the professional life, because in the 1930s, Neidhart was working in Le Corbusier's office in Paris, and then he returns to Bosnia, even though Le Corbusier was offering him to go to Brazil with him. And then the Second World War starts and everything. So basically, it was a period in which he was also trying to claim a space for him for his practice within the changing architectural scene in Yugoslavia. So there are several ways in which this book operates, and this is seen in the ways in which the authors decided to show the content of the book. So, beside this really systematic, besides this kind of what we really recognize as a really systematic content page, both in Serbo-Croatian and in English, there are also which are kind of in each of the segments. So there are systematic segments which are called the people and the country, the city, the charshia, the mahala, the house, the unwritten laws, and the revival of Bosnian and Herzegovinian architecture. Authors have decided to represent the structure of the book with 3 different drawings, one of which is a tree. So, as you can see here, this is the tree. I will go back to the tree a bit later. This is the map. This is the map of the areas which are included and analyzed in the book. And this is the panorama of important axes in Bosnia and Herzegovina between Vranduk, Ilidža, Sarajevo, and Trebević. So it's basically valley in which Sarajevo, which is the core of their research, developed. And this part here has also this part which is called the sketch for orientation, which is naming all the different important roads, but also landmarks such as Ali Pashin Mosque. So it is really, already on the level of the content, we see that the attempt of the book is trying from many sides to capture something that was not necessarily considered until then. The traditional architecture in Bosnia, which of all the parts of Yugoslavia was, beside Macedonia, the most influenced by the Ottoman, but unlike Macedonia, Bosnia was influenced even more by the contact between Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Venetian, Sephardi Jewish communities. So it was really trying to look and situate this and situate this by looking at it as something with which one can expand the modernist language of architecture. It was about reappropriation, and it was not about erasure, and it was not about documenting in order to step out of it, but it was about looking at it in order to think and incorporate this. So, and what was also important is that this process was happening because the horizon was the future. It was about building a new society in space. And the attempt was never to draw a hierarchical genealogy that would claim superiority of the contemporary moment, but to stay with the complexity. If you want to more work about this book, I would suggest you to look at the work of Meira Mazatrić, who especially took focus in her thorough work on this book also especially looked and mapped all the different ways in which tree appears in this book. But let's look at the tree for a moment, because I think it also shows that how it can be misleading to look at the tree and to immediately read it through this idea of trying to do Fletcher, because it's actually not doing that. Even though, if we look at the roots, there are elements which are similar to the elements that Fletcher puts in the roots. So, the tree is captioned as graphic representation of the items contained in the book. And then in the roots we have topography, climate, building materials, techniques, various influences, religion, tradition, temperament, and societal structure. Then the trunk starts by saying people and earth or soil. And then the trunks are unwritten laws. Architecture in the scale of human, domed and cubic architecture, surfaces and structures, a house without furniture, houses that grow, spatial architecture, relation with nature, right to the view, and construction procedures. Then we come to the beginning of the branches where city is situated. And then we go into Charshia, which is a Serbo-Croatian word of Ottoman origin, which means commercial part of the city, which then branches into sacral buildings, which includes mosques, graveyards, medrese, and secular buildings, where you have commerce, cafes, beds, musical instruments, khans, and caravanserais. The second branch focuses on Mahala, which is a residential part of the city, where you have here kind of supporting buildings, where again we have kafana, the green market, bakery, a water fountain, a dairy, cemetery, and again we have a mosque. Then we have another branch which is housing, which then in this direction grows into a garden, a watermelon, green, where you grow kind of vegetable garden, sofa, stream. Then in this other we have a courtyard where we have neighbors, we have a gate, we have again water fountain. Then here we have the lower economic part of the building, we have a house, and then which is then split in the economic support rooms of the building, and the upper floor where are places such as porch or living room, but also rooms. So this really kind of shows the complexity of this book, and how it was really difficult to actually come to terms what was in the book. And then this book, for example, just one of these pages, they are really diverse, which also shows various time and representation and the kind of trying to understand. So, and this is from, and the pages are called architectural compositions, and you have everything, again, here. From sketches, night card sketches about contemporary construction systems, elements of construction systems, but also conceptualization of of the facade of the People's Parliament that he was designing, where actually he is describing this composition by using some of these elements that he derives from this architecture they were looking there. So for Neidhart, especially, but also for Grabrian, becoming contemporary, which was achieving the society that was a horizon of that was set by the Yugoslav socialist workers' self-management and societal property, the horizon promised by the socialist revolution that was also an anti-fascist liberation during the Second World War, was predicated upon the ability to use the language of modern architecture in order to build a new society. But this language of modern architecture had to be complicated and made much more complex. This was also informed by the position of Neidhart as the other from Balkan in the office of Le Corbusier, because there is a different interesting tension. After working at Le Corbusier's office, Neidhart comes and starts to look precisely as those things that Le Corbusier marked in his journey to Orient as not interesting and ugly. Neidhart addressed this in his in memoriam, with which the book, for Dusan Grabrian, for which the book starts. I quote, "I should thank Dusan for revealing to me a huge treasure of the architectural heritage of Bosnia 15 years ago, and that was, for my further work after Corbusier, of great importance." So Dusan and Juraj needed each other in order to enable each other to see. Dusan Grabrian was an architect from Slovenia who before that was really focused on understanding traditional architecture, but focusing solely on the house. And before this book was published, a shorter book called Macedonian House was published. I quote again from Juraj Neidhart in memoriam. "Having well noticed that the Bosnian house is only one detail in the entire architectural and urban issues of Bosnia's heritage, we have decided to add chapters: people and the country, city, bazaar, mahala, unwritten laws, and the analogies with modern architecture." So, looking at the way of how to look at the architecture of Bosnia in all its complexity, and to keep this complexity for the modern architecture is the project for the new society that is based on horizontality. This was something that I think was in the core of this book. So I would argue that this book is an attempt to reappropriate and situate and not to reject. According to artist Kader Atija, I quote, in which he kind of uses, artist Kader Atija situates the word reappropriate with these words. "Finally, Fanon situated the word in the colonial context, raising the issue of reappropriation in relation to the notion of repair and what people have been dispossessed of. In this context, I think this is important to really bring, that what Neidhart and Grabrian are doing, they are actually situating and reappropriating something, the view on their own built environment that they have been deprived of historically, but also through the idea of kind of professional education in the architecture, which was in that context, on one way, highly influenced by Vienna and Germany. At that moment, and the moment when they start looking at this project, this was monarchy of Yugoslavia, which was highly classicist kind of architecturally, in which being modern architect also meant being leftist, and Communist Party was banned. But it also meant realizing that modern architecture is not necessarily responding to everything they see along. So it was important, how do you see, and understand how one looks at things. So if we say that Fischer doesn't want to fabricate the history of architecture, but wants to claim the space for his specific project in the differentiated existing histories of architecture. I think that this is possible to kind of think with this book as that as well. There is a difference here that is fundamental and important to capture, the one in which language does not have to completely take over, in which it is possible to use the language of classicist or modern architecture to recover something of the past for the future without claiming hierarchy. Okay, now I jump to my second episode. This is a little bit like Netflix. The second episode is related to the work of that Yugoslav architects did between 1970s and 1980s, and the episode looks at the problem: what does it mean to situate oneself from a in a different size, in different contexts, in ways in which one has to constantly reshuffle and understand, okay, where am I now, and what am I doing, and what is the time frame? What does it mean to situate oneself inside the country, but also what does it mean to situate outside of the country in the global, political, international, economic, but also cultural system? This episode is connected to the construction company Energo Projekt, and certain architects who worked in certain projects from this construction company, and this is also connected to the non-aligned movement and the idea of non-alignment and the attempts to create a network of the so-called South-South cooperation. And this episode is also connected to the question of negotiating the language of modern architecture, dare I say, against its universalist factor. So why Energo Projekt? It's a kind of lens through which to look at this construction company. It was founded in 1951. This Yugoslav construction company became synonymous with the engagement of Yugoslav economy abroad, and especially with the engagement with the non-aligned movement and non-aligned movement countries. Majority of the projects of this company from mid-1960s until late 1980s were outside of Yugoslav borders in over 40 countries, and you can see this. Some of these countries, this is a scan from one of their official brochures. Utilizing the knowledge and the skills developed in both and actually construction of Yugoslavia, and you can understand a little bit about that construction from the previous episode. The tools offered by the spatial type of socialism developed in Yugoslavia, worker self-management. Energo Projekt offers a lens which can capture how construction enterprise with a strong architectural department became the tool for development of Yugoslav economy, but it became this kind of a problem with which we can think situatedness at the larger scale. It is also exemplary for understanding how the exposures to the markets abroad enhanced already existing affinities within the enterprise towards corporate culture and allowed them to develop and be highlighted, and therefore introduce certain blind spots in their capacity to situate themselves. And working mostly in this non-aligned countries, Energo Projekt utilized very well the geopolitical position of Yugoslavia in that historical period and its ability to work across different systems and networks, as well as the autonomy to be able to independently from its own country negotiating economic supports from even commercial Western banks, which was one of the features of Yugoslav socialist self-management. So, and it was actually really successful comparing to how usually on a global scale our territory is successful mostly by producing problems. I have to do some this self-depreciating humor. I did not sleep, I apologize. Because in the 1970s was amongst the most successful enterprises globally, especially when compared with the size of economy from the country it came from. And in the 1980 annual survey of the Engineering News record, it was ranked 6th in the field of consulting and 20th in the of turn key contracts. The ambition of Energo project found its materialization in the two office buildings for the company in Belgrade. The one was designed and built from 1958 to 1960 as a high modernist tower designed by Milica Šterić, the chief architect and director of architecture department of the company from its inception in 1951 to 1976. Which also signals how certain type of modernism, specific type of modernist architectural language was really important for the self-perception of that company. She was famous for her motto that architecture is, so I quote, "What is architecture, comrades? Avant-garde. Design is the activity of the utmost importance, and us, the architects, are those whose obligations is to open roads, enable success to all of us by acquiring new commissions. We are the ones opening the doors to the commercial and other departments." End of quote. So it was this building that these heads of states that gathered in Belgrade in September 1961 when for the first summit of non-aligned movement would often pass by on their way between Federal Parliament building, the main site of the conference, and just completed federal government building on New Belgrade. The Tower of League of Communist Parties of Yugoslavia was still under construction, so this was actually Energo Project's international style corporate building was actually at that time one of the highest and most prominent buildings in the city. And I think here is also important to note that the building was designed just upon the return of Milica Šterić, who spent 6 months in a study visit working in the office of Van der Broek and Bakema in Netherlands, which I think is visible in the architecture. Okay, so this is situating the company. And then the second office building that Energo Project built for itself in 1982, which is this postmodern cathedral, which again shares this idea that this is framing certain use of certain architectural language in order to claim certain ambition, but this ambition now is different. It's an ambition to kind of control and put everything in one totality. All this is a complicated way to situate actually few slides that I have more, which are actually going to ask to look at organization of a conference hall and transformation of a round table. So in 1971, Zambia was to host the third summit of non-aligned movement, and for that venue had to be built. Mulungushi Hall, or as it was known and advertised by Energo Project, the miracle in Lusaka. The 1983 New York Times feature on Energo Project starts with an almost filmic description in which Mulungushi Hall is at the center of the story. In 1972, Kenneth Kaunda, the president of Zambia, faced a crisis. I quote, "He had called a conference on non-aligned nations for Lusaka, Zambia's capital, and with just 4 months to go, there was no place for delegates to meet. It could have been the most embarrassing, but Mr. Kaunda telephoned officials of Energo Project, Yugoslavia's biggest construction concern, and told them he needed a 4,000-seat convention hall fast, with price no obstacle, and they came to rescue. While the Fischer mistook the year in which Mulungushi Hall was built, it communicated very well the urgency to which the project responded. Whether it was via phone call to Belgrade or to Energo Project representative already working in Lusaka for 4 or 5 years at that moment, the construction of the Mulungushi Conference Hall and the residential complex to house the delegates at the meeting was contracted in April 1970 for a summit that was scheduled for early September of that same year. So this was a key moment in the history of non-aligned movement and Zambia. Zambia was entering its 5th, 6th year of independence and wanted to kind of enter into the global stage. And for that, it needed an infrastructure. on one side. But on the other side, usually non-aligned movement meetings happened every 3 years, but between the second and third was a 6-year break. So this was a crisis of continuity. It was make it or break it. So this one became really important. And in order to kind of to show that the younger generation of African leaders, to which Kenneth Kaunda was kind of representing, still believed in the capacity and power of the politics of non-alignment to create a difference in the world system. So again, in Lusaka, and what became really important in this process was how to organize an auditorium in order to kind of host a meeting which shows that everyone sitting at this table are equal and that this is a conversation among very different politicians in very different countries coming to, and sitting together. So basically then the organization of the conference table became the key elements around which the whole conference hall was designed and which determined the scale of the whole project. And this table became something that continued to dominate the visual memory of the conference. And this was this large circular table designed so that each of 62 heads of states can sit at it. The table was inspired by the table that was made in Belgrade for the first meeting, but for a much smaller number of participants. The idea behind the table was that such type of spatial disposition would symbolize horizontality and that the movement was trying to achieve and also ensure in practical terms that the seating order was alphabetical and that everyone can see everyone else throughout the whole period of the conference. In Lusaka, actually for purpose of time, I'm going to skip this. So during Lusaka conference, Josip Broz Tito, Yugoslav president, commented that the non-aligned movement policy opened, quote, opened the perspective of new international relations, emphasizing the principles of independence and self-determining development of countries and comprehensive international cooperation based on equality, as well as the need for the accelerated development of developing countries. So new diplomatic spaces, new diplomatic relations needed new physical spaces in which to unfold, and what was the best way to support the building of economic connections than to materialize them in concrete, brick, and an aluminum. So these projects were among the most tangible materialization of the words and ideas that were often expressed and discussed during these summits, words such as modernization, industrialization, infrastructure, and the belief that with their existence the progress will surely follow. The decades after bring different understanding, but it's important to situate this belief in that specific historical moment, which even in the case of Lusaka was happening before the oil crisis, so before the big reorganization of economic relations around the world, in which this language meant something else than the way we see it now. And for this question on in relation to situatedness, I think it's really important to kind of bring this quote of the architect of the conference hall, which shows also the difficulty of situated. So Dusan Milenkovic, an architect of the conference hall, but also a residential complex of 62 villas made to accommodate 62 heads and delegations that had confirmed their participation, described the project as, quote, as a combination of the laws of functionality with the laws of aesthetics, combining elements of the local African exoticism with those of the standardized European culture. Ouch. So this sentence captures really well the increasing difficulty that Yugoslav architects, and especially engineers and architects and other experts, experienced in situating themselves within their own country in relation to what was the relationship between the history and understanding the way they were orientalized in relation to the language of architecture that they were trying to use within their own countries, really had difficulties to do that when they were stepping outside in the other context, in which they were all of a sudden realizing that they were becoming European. And how this was really shifting the perception. That this perception really did not change with time, but it just that this increasing the difficulty to situate oneself in the projects and context became even more difficult is visible even more in 1980s when we come to the conference hall design for Harare in Zimbabwe for the 6th summit, where we see the radical break with the approach developed by Energo project in the previous decade. There is no roundtable anymore as the key organizing design element for the main conference hall, and the principle of horizontality was abandoned. The hall, rectangular in its base, was organized vertically with 2 steep juxtaposing seating galleries on the longer sides that was modeled after British Parliament, which for architects represented the spirit of democracy they wanted to convey. The irony of using such reference for representative building of the former British colony escaped the authors, if not only then when they were designing, but even in the text they wrote about the project 2 decades later. What was at play was the colonization of the imagination by the Western imaginary, which had been translated into the architecture. This was a reduction in complexity and not staying with the complexity. And also, in a way, a reminder, at least for me, not to romanticize this period, and that by 1980s, for Energo projects, architects, both the non-alignment and anti-colonialism became true rhetorical devices forgotten as a principle. Okay, I think I'll skip this for the question of time, and I will just jump into the conclusion. I also just want to show you that episode 3 would have been about, in relation to this building, which is a state secretariat in Kano, Nigeria, also built by Energo project, designed by architect Zoran Bojovic with Milica Šterić in the late 1960s, but not necessarily just in relation to what we see here on this image, but in relation to what we see in this other image, where from the newly completed building, one is looking at the traditional Hausa architecture, which actually was something that architects fought to keep on the site while they were designing this building, because for them it was really important to establish and learn from this architecture and to connect these things. So looking at Energo project enables us to understand that it matters how things are done, and that just the experience of the South-South collaboration was not enough to raise a different type of consciousness, and with that a different type of imaginary, or that it is impossible to keep and carry constantly the same consciousness and take the same imaginary, thinking that nothing changes even though geopolitical context changes, the context changes, and also the relationship of architect within its own practice and a career and a position in a profession changes. The historical is not given, as Pier Paolo Tamburelli says in his text. That troubles Milenkovic and Energo project, who have got the job but lost the drive to situate themselves in relation to the relation, to stay in the relation, if I can riff of Edgar Glissant. Milenkovic, despite the years he had spent working on various projects in Africa, was paradoxically with time less and less able to resolve this contradiction of his own and Energo project's engagements. This was partly due to the contradiction that Energo project was increasingly facing in Yugoslavia, as well as not only in the non-aligned countries. The impossibility to continue to straddle 2 chairs and bridge the expectations of socialist solidarity with capital intentions and benefits, as architects and engineers in Yugoslavia were increasingly moving to the side of techno-managers, and one opposed to the workers and pro-class divisions that were starting to emerge again. And those are working abroad were especially susceptible to this process. But I think what is here is important is that to understand that this was the changing nature, or understand that not the changing nature, that's the pervasion and continuity on imagination and self-understanding by something that Caribbean theorist Sylvia Wynter calls man one and man two, or the overrepresentation of one specific genre of human as the universal human. And that's the human we know in architects really well. That's Leonardo's universal man, that's the human. So I think this is something that I kind of wanted to add in response to the previous presentation, and what do we need to maybe let go, and also in response to your introduction, in which how to find these different genealogies or different ways to look at this material. So as the conclusion of the conclusion, I will again quote you, sorry, Pier Paolo. States that, quote, the Entwurff is an attempt to expand the architectural discipline, to imagine a form of knowledge capable of dealing with the different traditions and understanding different cultures. End of quote. And that Fletcher, in a way, does not want to reform the grammar. He does not care about its shaky foundations. He is contented with expanding the same grammar. So, end of quote. And in these episodes that I have outlined, the stake of situating was maybe higher than it seemed so in the Fischer's moment, but also in the context in which the stakes were higher because it asked for a constant renegotiations and shifts in relations to many shifting poles. Situatedness is a trouble, and it asks for being in constant reflection. Dusan Grabrian, in the introduction to the Macedonian house, or the transition of the old Oriental into the contemporary house, as the subtitle of this building says, the struggle for the true image of the past is only the struggle for the true image of one's time and oneself. And I think this is really important. And also it is really important that in that book, as well as in Arhitektura Bosne, Grabrian used modern architecture of a house especially, and especially projects of Loos and Le Corbusier, as the lens that he appropriated it, prepared it to see what authors labeled as not worthy of their attention to see. So, and even though they were often modernist architects drawing more from what they were willing to erase, they were never really admitting to which extent they were drawing from the same source, from the similar type of sources. I return here to Kaderatia, who stresses how, quote, Western modernity has a cynical ability to remove by appropriation any trace of the identity of a non-Western culture, sometimes even by recreating its own mythologies. Why? In order to control. As Edward Said demonstrated in Orientalism, the West has Orientalized the East in order to controlling. By emphasizing the idea of quote-unquote, progress should be a synonym for, quote-unquote, today, or, quote-unquote, tomorrow, but never for, quote-unquote, yesterday, the West has excluded tradition from their lives and cultures of non-Western people, end of quote. Those on the other side of the West have found a way to reappropriate their past for their future by using the common language of architecture as a proxy for translation. Perhaps what we can take from Fischer and what makes thinking with him so important today is close to what Bell Hooks asks when she writes in 1994 that, quote, the point is not to render ideas less complex, but to make the complex clear, end of quote. There is an absence of hierarchy in Fischer, even though some contemporary readers of this book see it as a hierarchical. This hierarchy is more in relation to the position and blind spots of the authors and not the need to hierarchize as such. He stays with the complexity, but he never addresses it, which also maybe is a sort of refusal. Oskar Davičo, a modernist Yugoslav poet, whose work I love to return to think situating through, wrote in 1962, upon his return from West Africa, in the moment in which countries he was visiting, Ghana, Guinea, and Togo, were just establishing their independence, that, quote, the fact that the struggle for the emancipation of Africa had no chance of success, nor allies in trouble before the consciousness of Africans started breaking the white color of whiteness into the darkness of ultras, black column, violet into missionaries, viola into neocolonial, Reseda as a liberal, and red as a socialist, end of quote. And that in realization to this, that the importance of decomposing the color white, he thought that, quote, it is necessary that the blue, gray, green, brown, and black eyes of white observers of Africa, temporarily at least, if not finally, turn their backs on the magnificent folklore, exotics, and other differences that have interested them so far, and actually look at similarities, and try to work with the complexity of what we see as differences, because difference often, as Kader Attia in his other text says, difference is maybe sometimes the only thing that actually connects us. And this is something we have to stay with. And this is where I want to leave you at. And I apologize for running over time.